Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Library Hour. The Legacy Foundation, as most of you I'm sure know, is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Our work is inspired by the United States Constitution, by the history, the values of the Union League, and by that first line in the Union League bylaws: every member shall support the Constitution and the free enterprise system. We support our mission of creating better citizens, more informed and more active citizens through a host of programs like tonight's Library Hour. As the keeper of the history, if you will, of the Union League, we also keep a lot of the traditions of the League. And over the past year, that's been a little bit more difficult in some cases than others. One of our great traditions, of course, is Lincoln Day. Lincoln Day, February 12th. We have an annual celebration, luncheon, program on Broad Street, parade, a whole day of festivities. And while we won't be able to do all of that, we will have Lincoln Day. We will be honoring our 16th president, and we'll have a great program. It will be virtual this year. On February 12th, we'll do it right at lunchtime. Everyone is invited. The good news is we won't run out of space as we usually do because it will be virtual. Our main speaker will be David Blight. Many of you may know David from his wonderful book on Frederick Douglass that was just released, I think, 2 years ago. And we'll be talking more about a wonderful project spearheaded by the Legacy Foundation, which is the commissioning of a portrait of Frederick Douglass. So we're going to share the link right now to register for Lincoln Day. We hope you will be joining us. You can just click on that and register and join us on February 12th. We hope you'll be there. So tonight's program will run about an hour in length. There will be a Q&A section towards the end of the program. And if you'd like to ask questions, please just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can ask questions anytime throughout the course of the program, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. And now to introduce our program, and our speaker is the historian of the Union League Legacy Foundation, the one, the only, Mr. Jim Mundy. Jim.
John, thank you very much. And good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Library Hour, our first one of 2021. Surprisingly, or maybe not, in the last 20, 25 years, a number of English academics have been studying American history, but specifically Philadelphia history, and Dr. Heath is one of three that I know of. And so we're happy to have him here tonight. He was preceded in the mid-90s by Andrew Dawson, who wrote Lives of Philadelphia Engineers, they being mechanical engineers, and then Peter McCaffrey wrote a book on When Bosses Ruled Philadelphia, which is that's a potboiler in itself. So it's nice to have Dr. Heath here to tell us a little bit more about Philadelphia history in the 19th century. So now to Dr. Heath. Dr. Heath is a native of Bristol, just outside Bristol, which at one point was Philadelphia's most important trading port in Britain. And Dr. Heath read history between 1997 and 2001 at University College London, where he received a first-class honors in history. And then he came to Philadelphia, much like other folks from Bristol, and where he received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2008. So he is a Philadelphian, as well as being from Bristol. He taught at the University of Pennsylvania and at Bristol University, and then joined the history department at the University of Sheffield in 2008, where he is currently teaching. His interests lie primarily in the 19th century and 20th century United States history. His work on Philadelphia was used in the production of the PBS ABC documentary series, Philadelphia, the Great Experiment, in which he appeared. Watch it if you can, it's a good show. He won the Student Union Academic Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2011 and 2012, and then 2012 and 2013, and a Senate Award for Early Career Teaching in 2013. And to get his kicks, you can often find Dr. Heath outside the classroom, riding through the roads in the Peak District outside of Sheffield in his spandex as he goes slower than the cars would like him to go. And if you've ever been in the Peak District, you know how beautiful that is and why you want to go slow. So it is with great pleasure and great honor that I introduce Dr. Andrew Heath to this evening's speaker. Dr. Heath.
Introduction, and thank you to the Union League for having me, especially on a day where I'm aware that one or two other things are going on your side of the Atlantic. Can I just check, is my screen shared at the moment, or do I need to? do I need to do that?
You need to do that.
I need to do that. Okay, so I will do that right away.
Okay.
Is that better now? That should be.
You're on. And I'm just.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to you for giving me the chance to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote as an obligatory plug. I've included the front cover here. And it started as the PhD, 2003, and it took me a long time. I think it's safe to say far too long to finish. It's a book that's about and was mostly researched in Philadelphia, and it looks at the city in a period that witnessed its most rapid growth, the decades either side of the Civil War. Growth, it's fair to say, caused growing pains, and if one question mattered above all others when citizens pondered their city, it was this one. What did the future hold? Would that growth bring peace and prosperity, or would it send Philadelphia into a spiral of disorder and decay? Now, the book itself tries to explore the conflicting answers that citizens arrived at here. But I wanted to focus today on one of the central figures, and that's Morton McMichael, not least as he's doubtless familiar to many of you as a founder of the Union League. Now, McMichael had a storied career. Born in 1807 in New Jersey, he came to Philadelphia as a young man, where he established a reputation as a poet. Edgar Allan Poe, no less, rated him highly. Before long, though, he'd embarked on an on and off political career, first as a Democrat, then as a Whig, and finally as a Republican. He served as a post-war mayor, presided over the Fairmount Park Commission, and was even briefly considered as Grant's running mate in the 1872 presidential election. But he made his greatest contribution to civic life as a newspaper publisher and public speaker. McMichael was no radical. When he appears in scholarly literature, he's usually cast as one of the more conservative Republicans of his generation, and he remained skeptical of the isms, abolitionism, socialism, and so on, that fired the imagination of some of his peers. But if McMichael was undoubtedly conservative in his instincts, he was also an avid modernizer. He ardently believed that progressive impulses were at work in the 19th century. And he believed too that wise legislation had to be framed with a view to distant posterity and not to short-term political advantage. This informed the way he thought about the United States, to which he was earnestly devoted. But it also informed the way he thought about his adopted city. And one thing I've tried to convey in the book is that these issues, the unity of the nation, the unity of the city, were entangled. We can learn a lot by thinking about them, as McMichael did, in tandem. Now, at the heart of my book is the story of the making of modern Philadelphia's boundaries. And I will try to convince you, it's not always an easy task, that this is a more interesting topic than it initially sounds. Philadelphia's city government at mid-century extended over just 2 square miles. It reached between the rivers and stretched from South Street to Vine Street. Well over half the population of the built-up metropolis, though, lived beyond its borders in a cluster of self-governing suburbs, many of which were among the top dozen or so largest municipalities in the Union. Now, these survive today mainly as neighborhood names, Kensington, Southwark, Northern Liberties, and so on. But their independent status prior to 1854 chimed with a Jacksonian conviction that white men should control their own local interests. Across the county as a whole, though, it meant that around 3 dozen separate jurisdictions had responsibility for some of the most basic functions of government. So Philadelphia looks something like a metropolitan miniature of the duchies, principalities, and free cities of the Holy Roman Empire in the period before German unification. Now, if Philadelphia looked like Germany before unification, then McMichael has some claims, at least, to be the city's Bismarck. From 1844 onwards, citizens launched a series of campaigns to unite the city and districts under one government. It's a measure usually referred to as consolidation. When they became frustrated with the inaction of the major parties, these civic unionists turned to independent politics. In 1853, they sent a pro-consolidation slate to Harrisburg. After that slate's victory at the polls, an executive consolidation committee, chaired by Mortimer McMichael, met to draft a new city charter. At one of the very first meetings, another founding member of the Union League, Henry M. Watts, proposed that the enlarged city shouldn't just absorb its outlying suburbs. Instead, it should swallow the entire county. McMichael immediately supported this vision of Greater Philadelphia, and he lobbied hard to win over its opponents. When the act he helped to draft was signed into law by the governor, it created what was, in territorial terms, the largest city in the United States. The authority of Philadelphia's councils now reached across industrial suburbs, immigrant enclaves, romantic rural retreats, and acre upon acre of farmland. Now, just a few years earlier, the United States has seized vast swathes of Mexico. Philadelphia now mimicked its actions with a land grab of its own. While Democrats, Whigs, and natives each supported the measure, most consolidators followed McMichael in gravitating to the Republican Party over the following decade. Having united the city, they turned to the task of uniting the Union. They'd already borrowed from the rhetorical arsenal of nationalism in their campaign to unite the city. At pro-consolidation meetings, they rallied to the cry, "In union, there is strength." When making the case for centralization, they compared Philadelphia's balkanized map to the states prior to the adoption of the Constitution. That the debates over the future of the city would become entangled with the fate of the Union itself is hardly surprising. Reformers drew up one new city charter as a battle raged over the annexation of Texas as a slave state. They drew up a second against the secession crisis of 1850, and a third, which finally secured the state government's approval as the incendiary Kansas-Nebraska Act wound its way through Congress. So in short then, their attempts to unite a metropolis took place against sustained agonizing over whether a nation half slave and half free could endure. And here, for all the differences between a city and a republic, consolidators confronted a conundrum that applied to all political communities. What held them together and what pulled them apart? Now, as slavery divided the Union in the 1840s, Philadelphians imagined their city playing a vital role in keeping the Republic intact. This wasn't easy, given the metropolis itself was divided by race, class, and party politics. When President James K. Polk's Veep, the Philadelphia lawyer, George Mifflin Dallas, cast the deciding vote in the Senate for a low tariff in 1847, a Philadelphia crowd burned him in effigy. I think I can imagine Eagles fans, to be honest, doing something similar today. And leading citizens didn't just turn a blind eye to endemic violence against Black citizens and their anti-slavery allies. They often led the mobs themselves. Mayor John Swift headed a crowd that dumped abolitionist literature into the Delaware. The city government blamed abolitionists when their new meeting place, Pennsylvania Hall, was burnt to the ground within days of opening in 1838. Still, figures like McMichael earnestly hoped that they could make Philadelphia a fulcrum of unionism, a city on a hill for the rest of the nation to emulate. That's not to say they didn't hope they could profit in the process. At the onset of the Mexican War in 1846, Philadelphia city councils poured millions of municipal bonds into the construction of a railroad from Philadelphia to the Ohio Valley at Pittsburgh. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which its creators hoped would drain the wealth of the West to the banks of the Delaware, would soon become the world's largest private enterprise. But Boosters' ambitions already extended beyond the Ohio. To them, Philadelphia might become the London of America, linking Europe and Asia. McMichael, who as early as 1839 had anticipated a US empire extending into China, saw the Pennsylvania as a way for Philadelphia to monopolize the fabled commerce of the Far East. Another early Union leaguer, William D. Kelly, called the Pennsylvania the first link in a chain that would bind the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But where Kelly, as a committed anti-slavery man, saw railroads planting the seeds of free labor in California and beyond, others viewed them as the bonds of union that would allow whites in the North and South to coexist peacefully. At the opening of the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1850, for instance, the future president and Pennsylvanian James Buchanan insisted that railroads could temper the passions of sectional feeling. Now, Buchanan was a Democrat, but it was a view that McMichael and many in his Whig party subscribed to as well. Whether they saw railroads as weapons in the struggle against slavery or as iron bonds of sectional interdependence, McMichael and his allies agreed that continental expansion would reshape the city and the nation. They foresaw debt-financed railroads bringing a torrent of trade into the metropolis. That trade, like a Nile flood, would course through the streets and nourish growth. Promoters tied urban manifest destiny, a term they often used to describe the city's outward expansion, to the imperial march of the United States as a whole. In the sense that the city and nation were expanding outwards in lockstep, became a linchpin of the case for consolidation. As one grew, the other would grow with it. The US had secured an empire for its people through diplomacy and conquest, the logic went. So too, then, should Philadelphians. Now, such analogies, of course, were not without their problems. White Americans might have celebrated the acquisition of new territory in the 1840s, but the question of whether it should be handed over to enslavers or to free Northerners looked like it might lead to civil war. Growth in Philadelphia, of course, didn't quite present the same conundrum. There weren't guerrilla bands of pro- and anti-slavery suburbanites ready to fight it out for land on the far side of the Schuylkill. But McMichael knew from personal experience that urban growth brought its own set of challenges. His paper feared that the tribute of the continent would prove too much for William Penn's 17th century streets to bear. So he aggressively pushed for schemes to retrofit Philadelphia's grid for the needs of commerce. When railroads set down tracks in the streets of working class suburbs, however, residents tore them up. But then railroads were just one source of conflict in Philadelphia's turbulent era of the 1830s and 1840s. Rioting became so common that elections that passed off peacefully were regarded as cause for civic self-congratulation. Fear that may become the case once more in the US, but we'll wait and see. On hot summer evenings, the battle cries of rival gangs would echo through the Philadelphia night sky. With alarming frequency, though, endemic violence would mutate into something bigger, a mob with a grievance. Abolitionists, African Americans, and Catholics became the most frequent targets of murderous violence. So Philadelphians had a problem. Their balkanized governments lacked both the capacity and the will to contain rioters. Prior to 1845, neither the city nor the districts maintained a professional police. Criminals could abscond by crossing the street into the next jurisdiction. The ancient post of sheriff, a county office rather than a city one, could raise a posse to preserve the police, but few unarmed citizens were willing to risk their lives by taking on the crowd. Invariably, the governor would be forced to call in the state militia instead. The riot problem came to a head in 1844, just a few months after the politically ambitious Morton McMichael had been elected on the Whig ticket to the sheriff's office, an office that proved something of a poisoned chalice for him. That spring, rumours had spread among the city's anti-immigrant Protestants of a Catholic plot to remove the King James Bible from the city's public schools. Protestants marched on Irish Kensington, razed Catholic homes to the ground, and torched churches across the metropolis. A few months later, after word of an Irish conspiracy to hide arms in a Southwark church did the rounds, another nativist crowd gathered in South Philadelphia. They obtained a cannon from the Delaware waterfront, and they fired improvised grape shot at the state militia. The ensuing artillery duel left about 24 citizens dead. In what might sound eerily contemporary, encampments of soldiers surrounded the city, which was placed under martial law. McMichael, who'd failed to nip the Kensington riot in the bud, took much of the blame. But others, though, recognised he'd been dealt a bad hand as sheriff. Stronger government was needed. and the first organised call for consolidation followed in the fall of 1844. Now, the riots of 1844, I suspect, did much to shape McMichael's subsequent outlook. He soon put his political ambitions to one side and turned instead to newspaper proprietorship, which I imagine proved much more congenial to him. By 1849, he had united two of the city's Whig papers to form the North American and United States Gazette. It was a paper that was too expensive and probably too elitist to enjoy a wide readership, but it was one that wielded considerable influence in the drawing rooms of the city's wealthy citizens. Perhaps as importantly, McMichael saw in the riots a nightmarish vision of where the city might be tending. Comparisons abounded between urban violence in Philadelphia and the French Revolution. Intrepid journalists started to find a tumultuous class of proletaires and Jacobins lurking in the courts and alleys that ran behind the straight lines of the grid. McMichael's paper questioned here whether Philadelphia really had any innate immunity to the revolutionary contagions that ravaged European cities. The truth is, it reported in a survey of one of Philadelphia's southern suburbs, all great cities are infested by a class rife for rebellion. The united city government, though, it argued, would have the power to quash revolt. As a committed unionist, McMichael also saw how the urban crisis of the 1840s mirrored growing national divisions. The first riot of 1844 coincided almost to the week with news of a treaty that would annex the slave-holding Republic of Texas to the United States, a proposal that electrified anti-slavery opinion. For some, strikingly similar lessons could be drawn from the two developments. Consider, for instance, Sidney George Fisher, Philadelphian diarist, dyed-in the wool conservative, who was close friends with McMichael and another Union League founder, Judge Clark Hare. Fisher saw urban and national disorder as closely connected. He'd warned after the 1844 riots that civilization across the world sat uneasily atop a thin crust of barbarism, and he now concluded that slavery was going to dissolve the Union. No polity of divided interest could endure, he wrote in his diary, and he foresaw a period in the not too distant future in which the nation would divide into 2, 3, or more republics. Fisher was similarly pessimistic about the prospects for Philadelphia. Unlike McMichael, he thought that municipal consolidation amounted to a fool's errand for the prosperous conservative city, and the poorer, turbulent suburbs were simply too different to unite under one government. Others agreed. The city, like the nation, they said, couldn't be governed by a strong central authority. Some critics talked of urban consolidation as a form of amalgamation, which is a term that white supremacists used at the time to conjure up fears of racial mixing, but which here implied the mingling of incongruous populations under a single government. Then, in the crisis of 1850, with southern states on the brink of secession, a state senator proposed creating a North Philadelphia and a South Philadelphia as independent cities, a scheme that almost seemed to insinuate the city itself was riven by its own irrepressible conflicts. Indeed, support or opposition to consolidation across the 1840s and 1850s doesn't seem a bad prediction on which side individuals would fall when the Union itself dissolved in 1860 to 61. The Philadelphia Blue Bloods, who expressed the strongest sympathies for the South in the war years, the so-called aristocratic Copperheads, had rarely lent their support to consolidation. One of those leading Copperheads, William B. Reed, had been one of the new charter's only vocal opponents in 1854. And during the secession crisis itself, citizens in rural northeast Philadelphia caught the disunionist mood and tried to break away from the city themselves. Among the few citizens in that part of Philadelphia to mount any opposition to the secessionist threats was actually the black abolitionist Robert Purvis. Advocates of consolidation responded with arguments rehearsed in the Federalist Papers 70 years earlier. A larger city, they claimed, would thrust better men to the fore than the demagogues who supposedly ruled the roost in Philadelphia's suburbs. That larger city would also have the power to impose peace across a vast area. Later, these ideas migrated easily into the case for national union too. Eli Kirk Price, whose success in shepherding the new charter through Harrisburg in 1854 earned him the moniker Father of Consolidation, warned of perpetual warfare if the southern states were allowed to go their own way. The border wars he spoke of bore a striking echo to the way he and his allies had discussed riots across Philadelphia's turbulent suburbs a decade or so earlier. Once again, real strength for him lay in union. By the early 1850s, McMichael had also come to the conclusion that an imperial city needed an imperious urban form to bind it together. Now, it's tempting here to go back to his childhood to understand his thinking. He'd grown up on the New Jersey estate of Napoleon I's exiled brother, Joseph, the former king of Spain. And I strongly suspect that the romance of the Bonaparte story appealed to him. Round about the time that McMichael was establishing himself as a newspaperman in Philadelphia, though, another scion of the Bonaparte clan was rising to prominence across the Atlantic. In December 1848, a few months after the overthrow of the French monarchy, Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the first emperor, won election to the presidency. 4 years later, he launched a coup that concluded with him ascending to the imperial throne as Napoleon III. Louis Napoleon's assault on French republicanism hardly endeared him to Americans. McMichael's paper called him a high-handed miscreant. But it also concluded that the French tolerated his rule as an alternative to socialism. And Napoleon's course, it argued, had lessons for the US. Red Republicans, the North American insisted, using the term it labeled radical European revolutionaries, needed to be put down in Philadelphia too, though in the New World, the ballot served in place of the bayonet as the weapon of counter-revolution. It wasn't Napoleon III's consolidation of power, though, that impressed McMichael, so much as what he did with it in reconstructing Paris. Under the direction of the prefect of the Seine, Baron Haussmann, the Second Empire transformed Paris into what one critic later called the capital of the 19th century. Old, narrow streets disappear, the North American reported, and new, spacious and elegant avenues take their place at the mere touch of Haussmann's magic wand. As consolidators in 1853 discussed the new city charter, McMichael's journal urged Philadelphians to mimic the improvements underway in France. And it was a theme the paper returned to often over the following years. Consolidators' hopes of turning Philadelphia into the Paris of America focused on two spaces in the city in particular: wide boulevards and narrow courts and alleys. Philadelphians had little room to innovate. The city had been laid out on a scale suitable for the 17th century, not the 19th. By the early 1870s, the North American even suggested overriding the grid with a series of radial avenues fanning outwards from Broad and Market. And before long, such plans were crystallizing into serious designs for the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, a project spearheaded by consolidator Eli Kirk Price's grandson. But in the 1850s, McMichael and his allies saw more realistic possibilities in the wider street on William Penn's original plan, Broad Street. Penn had envisaged Broad as the heart of his green country town, but as early settlers clung to the port, the land around it wasn't developed until the 1830s and 1840s. Railroads then occupied the avenue with tracks, and by mid-century, coal yards lined the street. These provided ample evidence of urban prosperity for sure, but they also stood as an affront to the prophecy that the avenue, as McMichael's paper put it, would serve as an image of Philadelphia, one that traced the strength, the power, the magnificence, the wealth, and the resources of this mighty aggregation of people. improving Broad Street became an obsession for McMichael. It occupied his editorial attention for the rest of his career. The remaking of Paris also shaped Consolidator's ambitions for the courts and alleys that supposedly bred riot and disease. By 1867, which was really the high watermark of support for a radical reconstruction of Philadelphia's urban space, the Evening Star proposed that the city should buy up 6 square blocks around today's 7th and Cater and reconstruct it. The infected district, as it was frequently called, needed levelling in their eyes. Now, I think here that both cause for boulevard building and cause for slum clearance hint at attempts to Americanize elements of Haussmann's design. But as Consolidators applied them to Philadelphia, they were enlisted in the service of nation building. Because Broad's length took it through Philadelphia's turbulent suburbs, as well as the city proper, it was, as the North American put it before the Civil War, no mere sectional avenue. It had the potential to tie the city together, binding the metropolis across its dividing lines, much in the manner that boosters hoped railroads could do for the US itself. The Civil War era Broad Street also became the terrain of patriotism. It was a street that was some way removed from the rebel sympathizers who lived in what's now Old City, and it was a street of suitable proportions to display the might of the Republic. So Broad served as the marching ground for troops and a site of recuperation for the wounded. It carried Lincoln's hearse, and of course it provided the lot for the Union League's new home, a new home that looked more like a mansion from Second Empire Paris than a political club in the Republican United States. Meanwhile, Unionists like McMichael hinted at the need to physically reconstruct the city's supposedly un-American courts and alleys that tended to return reliable majorities for the Democrats. Genteel Republicans compared the slums of New York and Philadelphia to the slave states. Each were plague spots in which treason festered. Now, by then, the Republican Party had gained the ascendancy in Philadelphia. The Consolidation Campaign in 1853 led McMichael, many of his party allies, to abandon the Whigs. When, as the sectional crisis deepened, it became clear that the old system of party politics couldn't be resurrected, Consolidators tended to migrate, albeit with varying degrees of enthusiasm, to the anti-slavery nationalism of the Republicans. Leading figures in the Consolidation Campaign, Frederick Fraley, William Morris Meredith, and of course McMichael, were among the early members of the Union League. McMichael himself returned to politics after winning election as the Republican candidate for mayor in 1865. His tenure in office, though, proved somewhat underwhelming. Fearful of alienating white voters, he kept silent during the campaign on the question of desegregating the city's streetcars, a measure the Union League had strongly supported in solidarity with Black Philadelphians. And ironically, he found his powers constrained by the city charter that he'd helped to design. Rather than strengthening the executive power of the mayor, as Consolidators hoped it would, the new charter in practice still vested a good deal of power in the ward politicians of councils. McMichael, who was always more comfortable among the city's wealthy gentlemen than among its partisan foot soldiers, decided not to seek a second term. So in office then, McMichael was no Haussmann. An imperial Philadelphia, a city of statues, of boulevards, of refined public squares, proved much easier to conjure up in the leader columns of the North American than it did to build in practice. Still, the post-war years did see a raft of costly city building measures, the boulevarding of parts of Broad, the extension of Fairmount Park, the commencement of the new City Hall. And all of these were made possible by the Consolidation Act of 1854. If nothing else, the new charter had created a financial behemoth, a city treasury that was capable of funding urban expansion through long-term loans. And that financial heft had been of immense importance in the war too. Then the city had borrowed massively, not to build railroads or boulevards, but to raise regiments. The bounty payments to recruits that came out of the city treasury ensured Philadelphia avoided the worst of the federal draft. And in doing so, it dodged too the murderous anti-draft rioting that hit New York so hard in 1863. But consolidation also helped Philadelphia to grow in another way. Not so much upwards through a grand urban form, but outwards. The logic here owed much more to Thomas Jefferson's vision of a yeoman republic than it did to Baron Haussmann's imperial design for Paris. Outward growth onto the vast terrain of the urban frontier would provide the fresh air and family life that citizens needed to flourish. Before the Civil War, McMichael's paper had compared Philadelphia's growth to the nation as a whole, arguing that in contrast to pent-up European like Manhattan, ample vacant land would enable Philadelphia to multiply its population without succumbing to the fires of social conflict. Philadelphia would be an expansive city of homes, a truly American metropolis. The metropolitan frontier, with its small houses and its contented property owners, would serve to safeguard order. There'd be no return to the riot era of the 1840s. Now, that wasn't to say that things would always go smoothly. The North American cheered on the suppression of organized labor in the 1870s. McMichael even came out of political retirement to advise the mayor on how to respond to the National Railroad strike of 1877. But just as the Union had survived the Civil War, though, McMichael seems to have retained a real confidence that the city would weather the storms that buffeted it during the Gilded Age. Thanks to consolidation, he believed, urban growth no longer carried the same perils it had just a generation or so before. Now, McMichael died just 2 years later in 1879. And among his eulogizers was the father of consolidation, Eli Kirk Price. Price argued that without McMichael's support, Philadelphia would never have secured the united government that it needed. McMichael, he told the mourners who'd gathered to remember him, had helped pacify the city, build it upwards and outwards, and ready it for the challenges of civil war. He and his friends, Price concluded, not only lifted up the city into power, but advanced the power and prosperity of the nation with it. Now, I probably wouldn't want to make quite such a bold claim for McMichael myself. I've sort of picked him out here because I see him as an exemplary figure, and also a fulcrum around which the campaign for consolidation coalesced, rather than somebody who was able to drive that movement on his own. But he was without doubt a man of considerable influence and persuasion, and he used his newspaper as a bully pulpit to give direction to wealthy Philadelphians, just as he used the Union League as a weapon of social influence to drive out the disloyal from high society. My sympathies, which probably become a little bit clearer in the book, sometimes lie with his critics, men and women who warned that growth would multiply inequality. And I think it's crucial too to remember that his designs for Philadelphia hinged at points on peace with enslavers, on settler colonialism in the West, and on a disregard for the democratic voice of many of his own city's citizens. Still, I hope in coming to a conclusion here that learning a little bit more about his career as a Philadelphian can help us to better understand his unionism. In both city and nation, he saw association, cooperation, and above all, union as the necessity of the age. His efforts to form the Union League and rebuild the Republic had their dress rehearsal in the union of his adopted city. The sectional crisis in the one and the social crisis in the other produced a similar consolidationist impulse. So thank you for your time. I think that is it from me. I've never figured out how to finish a Zoom talk. So sorry, I'm just trying to bring my screen back here. So.
And okay, I think your button is at the top of your screen where you compress your.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. I think that should get you a full screen.
Sorry about this.
No worries. All right.
Okay, yeah, that's working. Sorry about that. I apologize.
Hey, live and learn.
This is new to me. I've sort of done this with lecturing, but I must say the live presentation is a novelty. So thank you for your time there.
Oh, thank you for yours, really. And in case everybody's wondering, remember, England is 5 hours ahead of us. So it is pretty late for Dr. Heath to be up right now. So we're very, very grateful for you to stay up this late, past your bedtime, I'm sure. And I hope your parents are okay. But thank you very much. That was, my head is just spinning with all the stuff that went, I just heard. But just out of curiosity, how does somebody from Bristol come to Philadelphia and get a PhD in Philadelphia, basically in Philadelphia history? What went on there?
Yeah, I wonder sometimes. I mean, one of my colleagues on the PhD program started working on Baltimore and then ended up writing her dissertation on Barbados, which seemed a rather nice place to go and do research. But I mean, I came to Philly as actually as an undergraduate. I did an exchange from the University of London in 1999, 2000, and got to know the department at Penn, and was encouraged to apply back for graduate school. The first person I met in Philly was my future wife. We met in an elevator on my way up to a dorm room. So I think that cemented my affection for the city. But yeah, I mean, I didn't go into Penn with the intention of writing about Philadelphia, but I just found walking the city. I mean, it's got such a sort of wonderful scale for the pedestrian, and I just sort of fell in love with it and became fascinated by it. I think I got quite attached to the places that I live. So yeah, it just sort of came out of that. So.
Darn. Okay. No, it's I always think of Philadelphia even today as an English Quaker Southern city. So I'm sure I can see why you felt at home.
Yeah, well, strangely in Sheffield, which is where I'm based now. We live right on the edge of an old Quaker neighbourhood, which is called Philadelphia. So I live right next to the boundary of Philadelphia ward. So yeah, the sort of Quaker legacy is quite strong. Similar city, I suppose, with the sort of non-conformist industrialist Quaker heritage.
Wow, who would have thought? I've been around it, but never in it. So
yeah, no, it's an easy city to miss actually on the sort of way to more desirable places to visit, I suppose, like York. So
no, I think well, regardless, I miss not having been there. I've been to Bristol, but I haven't been.
Yeah.
Phil. So, but nonetheless, though, actually, we even at the League, we don't know a whole lot about McMichael. He is one of the written about founding members, if you will. I think because of his fairly shy, I won't call him shy, perhaps, but he wasn't exactly a type A personality either. And so therefore, he never really hit the spotlight the way that George Boker did, for instance, or even a Clark Hare, for that matter, who was pretty aggressive in a lot of ways. So it's good for us to learn more about McMichael in this way, I think. At least I am. So I know that the first chance I get, I'm picking up a copy of the book and reading it. Because I imagine that is just chock full of other League members as well. So now, what year does your book end, in the sense like?
It ends in 1877 with something of an epilogue. So, sort of bookended by these two moments of urban disorder, beginning sort of turbulent era of the 1830s, 1840s, ending with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877.
Okay.
And I sort of chose to end it there, really because I think in some ways it marks a sort of fitting endpoint for the urban vision of those mid-century consolidators. They'd imagined that building a major corporation like the Pennsylvania Railroad, they'd imagined that sort of reconstructing Philadelphia's urban space would bring peace and prosperity to the city. By 1877, they pretty much lost control of the railroad. Sort of the aid, what for them was once a sort of an agent of metropolitan cohesion, is itself a source of disorder, and they're trying to make sense of it. I mean, moreover, and I know this is a story with the Union League that I draw a lot on sort of McCaffrey's work in some of the final chapters here to sort of build that case. But you know, the Republican Party, rather than a wealthy sort of cadre of property owners, is really pulling the strings by this stage, right?
Well,
so it's not so much the men who consolidate Philadelphia. Often they have their party loyalties. I mean, McMichael, for the most part, is a loyal Whig prior to 1854, but I think he's somebody who sees his loyalties perhaps more to that economic elite, the attorneys, manufacturers, merchants. He's good friends with leading Democrats. He's not somebody who's going to, cut somebody off for voting the wrong ticket.
Sure.
And I think for him, he imagines the sort of best men will lead Philadelphia by the early 1870s. That's not really the case. It's the Republican Party machine is Stokely right is sort of taking control. And
interesting, yeah. Or James McManus at that point.
Yeah,
absolutely. So interesting. So I thought maybe you ended in 1877, so that you conclude the centennial of 1870.
Yeah.
Which was truly, I think, the epitome of Philadelphia's popularity in the 19th century.
Yeah, and it's certainly there. It appears, and there's work on the centennial that sort of really emphasizes the influence of Paris and Houseman's design on the layout. I mean, it's much easier to do right in Fairmount Park than it is in the city to sort of build these grand avenues and monumental buildings, because that ground is empty. It doesn't come with the same costs as reconstructing densely developed urban neighborhoods.
No, absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, I hope that our audience goes out or at least stays at home and clicks on Amazon and starts buying a copy of the book, because it sounds like it's a great story. And if you're into Philadelphia history, it's one that we should all obviously know more about ourselves, and especially those of us who are at the League, whether employees or members, because it's a Union League story in many, many ways at the same time. So it's funny, I had never connected Broad Street with the Grand Boulevards or Paris, and therefore I had never connected John Fraser's, the architect's, choice of Second Empire for the clubhouse itself. But now it's got me thinking. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think most architectural historians are sort of skeptical of the idea that Second Empire urbanism, that kind of design. I mean, City Hall is the same, right? It's the mansard roofs, and it could have been a French town hall. I think for the most part, they're sort of skeptical of the idea that this represented a sort of serious embrace of Bonapartism. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that the sort of good Republicans who founded the Union League were really secret Bonapartists or anything. But I think they did recognize that
you never know.
if they wanted a city to look and behave the way they thought it ought to, that required a degree of despotic power that was, damn hard to produce in a relatively democratic city like Philadelphia, and one in which the rights of property holders too were pretty firmly entrenched. So I think it just sort of led some of them. Michael at points in the 1860s is sort of talking about the way that Napoleon III has figured out the way to advance a town, wishes that Philadelphia had a city government that was as upstanding and as expert-led as the kind of men that Houseman could appoint in France. I mean, I think he's completely misreading what was going on in Paris. It was a mess. It was corrupt. It was.
No. I think you read it right, because that's what happened to Philadelphia. So what the heck?
Yes, yeah, indeed. I mean, it's this sort of battle of which is more corrupt here, an imperial monarchy or a sort of democratic republican city.
Yeah. With its political machine.
Indeed.
So it's all, but it's. My brain's just whirling too fast right now. But anyway, so Doctor, thank you so much. That was just wonderful. It was phenomenal. We wish you all the best with things in England with the virus, just as we're going through struggles here in the States. And again, it just thank you. We cannot thank you enough for taking.
Thank you. I mean, thank you for coming along. I realise it's been a big day in the US, and I've sort of recorded everything to watch over over tomorrow. I was finishing this up today, but yeah, I mean, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to be able to meet you in person in sort of happier circumstances. And
I don't know who will get. I don't know if I'll get to England first or you get to Philadelphia first, but you are most cordially invited to come to the League, stay at the League, and be our guest.
Well, likewise, if you are in the Peak District or vicinity, then please do drop me a message. It would be a delight.
Absolutely. We'll take you up on that one. Absolutely. All right. We'll see who gets first. You bet.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, and likewise. All right. For those, goodbye now. And for those of us still watching, we have some programs coming up, right? We have a Civil War Roundtable a week from tonight. So next Wednesday features Dr. Charles Poland, who will talk about America's great terrorist, John Brown and the Harper's Ferry raid. You never know. We had picked the program before the events of the last few weeks. So there are bound to be parallels. I can hardly wait to hear that lecture itself. And then, of course, there's Lincoln Day on February the 12th with David Blight, one of the foremost Civil War scholars in America. I mean, he's won every history award there is to win. And we've been trying to get Dr. Blight for 2 years, so we finally got him. So I couldn't encourage you enough to go visit with him, or to watch the program itself. And then finally, our first Liberty Series program, or actually the first one in February, is going to be on the 18th. We'll feature Dr. Robert George, and the title is Civil Liberty and the Rise of Cancel Culture. Another very relevant topic. So there we go. So a shout out to the Legacy Foundation for sponsoring these programs. They're wonderful. They're great. And we all learned something that we didn't know before, which is what this is all about, I hope. So thank you all for watching. We appreciate your patronage and your support. Continue your support to the foundation by all means, please. It's just a great thing for the League to have, the Legacy Foundation. So on that note, I will say goodnight and goodbye, and stay safe, everyone. Stay well. Goodbye.